Before we
Well, good
start,
morning,
I want to give a
everyone,
shout out
and
to June
thank you
Penny.
for
She was
joining. It's good to
instrumental
see
in
that
creating the
there's an
gardens you're
interest in
about to
this
see.
topic. So yes, so today I'm going to discuss landscape design, garden planning and design. Now, before diving in, I just wanted to reflect on one of my favorite quotes, and this is from Claude Monet. And he's known to have said that his garden is his most beautiful masterpiece. So if you pause there for a second, here we have one of the most famous artists in history, and probably the most famous impressionist artist, saying that among all the things that he's created, his garden is his most beautiful masterpiece. And so when I reflect on this quote, I think I know what he's getting at. I mean, the garden is a living and ever-changing visual art form. Every day, every part of the day, every part of the month, season, it's a different sort of visual image that one has. So I encourage you to, when you think about planning and designing a garden, I encourage you to think of your garden as your canvas. And one of the terms that I'm going to sort of repeat often in this presentation is to visualize, because I think that's very important when you're planning and designing, whether it's a small or large garden, is to visualize so that you're happy with the end result. So Claude Monet's gardens, his home garden is in Giverny in northern France, Normandy. He moved there in the latter part of his life. And he had two large gardens there, but in particular, the water lilies garden, which you see on your left here, and visitors can visit these gardens today. They inspired him to create over 250 oil paintings over a period of 20 to 25 years. And that's an amazing volume of production of paintings from that one garden. And so I think, for Monet, when he looked at the water lily gardens, every time he saw it, he had a different inspiration, or the visual aspects at a given time of day or year made him feel differently about his garden. And so I think for all of us, our gardens, as we look at it and others look at it, we all see it differently, and it inspires us to think differently about it. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover the following topics. We're going to start with site conditions and then go into project management, what I call project management, planning, and design. And I think this is an important part of what my thoughts are on this process of creating a garden. And then we'll get into a little bit of how to go about creating your garden, planting locations, garden styles, types of plants, maintenance and care, which is an important aspect of your garden, not necessarily related to the actual creation of it. And then if time permits, I'd like to do a case study. So let's start with site conditions. So your plants, if they're happy, they're going to grow and develop. And if your plants are not happy, well, you're going to be frustrated, you'll be unhappy, and it could be a costly end result. So what makes plants happy? Well, it's really the environment and site conditions. The right plant in the right place is what you're looking to achieve. And what impacts the success of the development and growth of a plant? Well, I think the starting point is, starting point is really the basics of botany. And I'm not suggesting here that you need to be a botanist and dive into the whole science of it, but I think it's good to look at a primer or refresh your recollection of the central aspects of plants, and that's the parts of the plants, how they grow and develop, the photosynthesis, respiration, and transpiration processes, and why and how sunlight, temperature, water, humidity, acidity, and nutrition affect growth. I think this sort of review will help you better select plants for the particular site conditions that you have. So before thinking about planning and designing, it's important to understand the site conditions that you have, starting with the USDA hardiness zone. Here in Westchester County, New York State, our zones are currently 6B, going north to south in the county, 6B, 7A, and 7B. So 10 years or 12 years ago, these zones were 6A, 7B, and 6A, 6B, and 7A. So as you can see, the zones have changed, and we can expect them to continue to change. Also, during that period of time, we've seen temperature increases on average by about 5 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's important to, as you plan your garden, think and keep in mind that the zones may change during the life of your garden. The components that are important to your site conditions are naturally sunlight, and that is something that's not within your control, except where and how you choose your site, and perhaps removing anything that might cause shade, such as branches from an overhanging tree, but largely not within your control. What is within your control is observing how the sun affects your site. In other words, observing the direction of the sun throughout the day, during the months, and during the seasons, and keeping a note of that, because that will help you select the right plants. Groundwater is an important part of your site condition, and that is possible for you to control both manually or through irrigation systems. And of course, soil conditions. This is very critical. Having the right soil is really the best starting point for a successful garden. So this is the acidity, the nutrients, and minerals. And of course, your plants need carbon dioxide, oxygen, and water from the air, which is ample. The other aspect of your site that you need to pay attention to is the drainage conditions. Is your soil compacted? Is there a lot of clay there? Is it a very shallow depth? Is there bedrock below it? These are things you can control, possibly not the bedrock, but certainly the other aspects. Your soil should be a good combination of silt, sand, and clay to give you good loam conditions, and so that you'll have nice drainage as well. The other thing about assessing your site conditions is, at a broader level, being cognizant of climate change. And I think we all sort of have noticed how spring is starting sooner. In fact, today, the temperature out here in where I live near New York City is 50 degrees at 7 o'clock this morning. And tomorrow, it's projected to be 25 degrees Fahrenheit. So we have a change in temperature of almost 25 within a 24-hour period. But spring is starting earlier, certainly. Summers are getting longer. Fall is getting later, and winters are getting shorter. And it's unpredictable. We are seeing more frequently severe weather conditions, both storms and droughts that are hard to anticipate. And also, with climate change, we're seeing the gravitation of certain species of plants coming north from south, including invasives and natives and weeds. So from a broader context, it's good to, rather than react to climate change, try best to plan for it by being flexible in your plant selections. And then that's the broader picture. The narrow picture is actually your microclimate. This is your site-specific conditions. As I mentioned earlier, observing the sun pattern at your particular site to see where you plan your garden, where the shade conditions are going to be, when will they occur. Included in this is understanding whether your garden's facing north, south, east, or west. A north-facing garden will present more damp and less light conditions. A south-facing will give you the most light. East-facing garden, you'll have morning light, and west-facing, you're going to see light in the late afternoon and evening. So being aware of which direction your garden is facing will give you an idea of which plants you need for sun or shade. And if you plan to do future garden modification expansion, examine your site for the conditions to permit you to do that. And lastly, one thing we'll think about in this presentation is the cost of doing all this. If renovation is required, build that into your budget. So let's talk a bit about establishing your bed. Having healthy soil conditions from the get-go is important because it is for the life of your garden, regardless of what you will plant there, change up. It is important to get that right to begin with, because once your plants are in, it's more difficult to correct the soil conditions. And if you're going to splurge a little bit, perhaps this is the area to splurge, which is getting the soil conditions correct, because it's a good investment. The soil program, building program, is really something that's ongoing. You've got to keep at it, maintain it, including doing soil tests periodically, making sure the acidity levels are correct and that you have enough nutrients. And incorporating organic matter will help make sure that you have good nutrients and give energy to your plants. And don't forget to make sure that you have your bed located near a watering source. So now that you've evaluated your site conditions, gotten a handle on that, it's time to think of and decided where you're going to put your garden. It's time to prepare the area for your garden, and that includes removing the existing vegetation. There are different methods you can use for that. One is sheet mulching, which is taking organic matter such as unwaxed cardboard or newspaper, laying it down and smothering it over a period of time, so that the sun can't get at the turf, the weeds, and it will eventually die off. This takes a bit of time to do, meaning you should plan on doing it the summer or early fall before the spring when you want to plant. And by then, everything should be killed off. The second method is solarization, and sort of mow down the turf or remove the vegetation, weeds, the best you can. Moisten the area, lay a clear plastic tarp over the area, and the heat from the sun will eventually kill everything off, and that should take about 4 to 8 weeks. And the manual method is basically putting some elbow grease into the ground and digging it out. In terms of preparing the garden bed, I think I would recommend the double dig method, which is you start by digging a row the width and depth of a spade, and taking the topsoil and putting it on a tarp or wheelbarrow, and then take a garden fork, punch up and loosen the subsoil. This will help your roots and give freedom for your roots to grow and expand into the soil below. After you've done that, put on a layer of compost or leaf mold in the trench in the row that you've just dug, and then move to the next row. Do the same thing, dig the topsoil. But with this topsoil, instead of putting it on the tarp or the wheelbarrow, fill up the first row with this topsoil from the second row. So you continue this process row by row until you get to your last row. And now when you've done the last row, you put some compost on it after you've used your garden fork to loosen up the soil. Take the topsoil from the wheelbarrow, put it in the last row, and now you're ready to compost the whole bed again. You've got one layer below, now you've got a second layer on top. And it's good to incorporate some dry organic fertilizer into the soil, such as bone meal, blood meal, or kelp and seaweed, along with fish meal, manure. There's all sorts of good stuff you can use, and you should have a nice raised bed, about 1 foot to 2 feet of good nutritious soil. Don't forget to mulch the garden bed. You don't want weeds coming in while you're busy planning and designing your beautiful garden. So now let's talk about planning and design. Project management is what I like to think of it as. And this is sort of a method of step by step I'd like to think is a good way to approach it. And the idea behind this is really a methodology that hopefully achieves a process for you to be cost effective, time efficient, and labor appropriate. Now, this so the Your Garden project will be an ongoing cycle of ongoing investment, because every year you'll be putting some money into it, some time and labor. And when you're creating the garden, planting it, it's going to involve a lot of money, time, and labor. So you want to make sure that the garden that you create is something that is manageable for you in terms of your limits on budget, in terms of the time that you're able to put into it, and the labor. And of course, you can, for example, contract labor out and get help from a gardener to deal with the time issues and labor issues, but that's going to affect your cost. But ultimately, you want these things, something that you evaluate appropriate for yourself, so that's well balanced given your limitations, and the end result was something that you can enjoy and you be satisfied with. So I talk about, to me, it's project management, the same way a renovation of a house is, because it is a lot of investment and there's a lot of elements, whether even a small garden or a large garden, there's a process that's involved. We all sort of do it, perhaps intentionally in step-by-step method, or sometimes we just sort of do it haphazardly. But it is, one way or another, in fact, a management of a project. And the skill sets are both organization and logistics, which is the left side of your brain, and artistic and creative, which is the right side. And we all have strengths in one or the other, but both are involved. And the components in the process involve planning, design, budgeting, timeline, schedule, and execution. Now, these are not all sequential by any means. They're more interdependent, interrelated, and it's an iterative process of going through each of these. So your plan and design may lead you to a budget that's too high, and you'll have to go back and redo the plan design, or your timeline will change, or your schedule and execution is impacted by bottlenecks in suppliers, for example, and you have to think about scheduling your gardening project into over maybe 2 years. So to start with the planning where do you start? Well, what's your vision? And I think in deciding the vision, you decide what the purpose of your garden is. Is it a family area? If it is, keep in mind that people are going to see your garden from a sitting position mostly. So you want to think about that viewpoint. If the child's area has slides and swings and play sets, you can have a nice pollinator garden for that area. If maybe you're looking to have curb appeal for your property, a garden can increase the value of property, or it can just be something you want people to admire about your property. But having a good understanding of what you're trying to do with the garden, whether there's a purpose, will help you focus on the design. We've talked a bit about the site conditions, but the planting location, something we'll talk about later. Each planting location presents challenges and attributes, and you have to keep that in mind. And of course, the budget. This is, as you've noticed, prices have increased for everything, especially items in the nurseries. It's amazing how quickly everything has gotten more costly. So this is an important aspect now, I think. You may have a garden of 5 feet by 10 feet. If you buy 10, 15 plants on an average cost of $25, and maybe a shrub will cost you $75, it adds up. And that's just the plants. It's not everything else involved. And of course, time frame is important. I recommend that you do a lot of legwork before you actually design your garden, so that you've got ideas that you can choose from. And this includes visiting nurseries, botanical gardens, garden shows, or just walking around your neighborhood, certainly books and websites. Take notes, take pictures, and when you get back to your designing stage, you can look at all that and help you decide what you can do. And part of that process is coming up with the garden style. We'll talk a bit about that. So with this, hopefully you've got everything evaluated in terms of site conditions, your overall vision, amount of money you want to spend, some ideas from research, and come up with a preliminary list of the types of plants you think you would like to use in your garden. Now we get to the design part, which is basically putting pen to paper. Here, when I say gather your tools, I simply mean get together what you'll need. You'll need measuring tape, steel measuring tape, about 100 feet to measure your property, graph paper, tracing paper, carbon paper, colored pencils, colored pens, maybe spray that you can use on lawns. They have those things, or a hose that you can lay out to lay out the parameters of your garden, stakes that you can put in the ground along with string or twine. Start off by measuring the property. You can look at the deed to get measurements for your property. You can look at Google Maps as an overhead to get an idea of what your property looks like. But on the grid paper, on a scale, perhaps 1/8 inch to a foot is a good scale. Set out exactly what you have on your property. Make sure to include and mark your utilities. If you don't know where they are, contact your utility provider and make sure you get an idea of where the lines are located. So now that you've drawn your property, you can take a tracing paper and put it on top of the grid paper. So for the design, mark out where you want your beds, your borders, your key structural elements, trees, shrubs, hedges. These are the larger components that you're not able to change in the future pretty easily. So you want to figure out those basic structures first, around which you will design the rest of your garden. You don't need to be pretty doing this, just use bubbles or oblongs to show, but show the spread as you envision it at maturity so you know how to space out the plants. You can go out with stakes and twine and visualize how everything will look in terms of where the trees, shrubs, or the borders of the garden will be. Come back inside, redesign, change up your design, go back, change it up. Through this process, come up with the design that you think you like. And the next stage is to look at your color schemes, and we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But have a rough idea of what kind of color schemes you're looking for in your garden and other attributes in the design part of it. From here, you will think about the secondary plant selections, and you've already have a list of plants you're thinking about and options, and start designing what you'd like to put where. And from here, you'll repeat the visualization at the site, go through, revise your design, assess the cost, compare it to budget, and come back and revise things if you need to. Ultimately, you have a final plan with the carbon paper. You transfer to a bond piece of paper if you want things to look pretty. The design from the grid, trace it onto the bond through the carbon paper, and then with the tracing paper design, put your gardens in and then color everything in. And you have make a couple of photocopies, which you can use for your implementation of the project. So here you go back to the plan. You have the plants you've selected. Now you can get pricing from vendors and contractors, finalize your budget, get a list of to-dos, timeline and schedule, and execute. It's an ongoing process. These are all variables. So you might find yourself continuing this process for a bit until you finalize it. Now let's talk about the fun part, which is creating your garden, how to go about designing it, and here's some ideas. So I think in designing the garden, there's some basic elements that help your focus on how to do this, at least from my perspective. And it's the visual aspect. And what is the visual aspect? It's the lines of your garden's scale and proportions, form and shape, colors, textures. Movement is visual and also can create sound. And you can have added element of fragrance. The other is sound, which you can create with chimes or water features. But these are the type of things that you want to think about when you're designing. So for example, this small garden here, which is one of my gardens, you'll see that, we've got scale and proportion. You've got different forms and shapes here. You've got colors, different colors, textures. This is another one of my gardens. So you see the textures and the different portions and scale in terms of scale, and movement. With the ornamental grasses, we have movement. And you can't see it in this picture, but there's peonies here. So we've got a bit of fragrance here as well. But even a small garden can have these elements. And if you start with these thoughts, it will help you focus a bit better on what you're looking to try to do. The second thing before putting pen to paper is the overall feel. So visualize the garden as it will look in full maturity and through the seasons. In particular, follow the viewer's eye movement, the lines and the flow, the focal points, balance, and rhythm. And balance you get through size, shape, and color, and rhythm and harmony is through proportion, transition, and unity. So here we have the viewer's eyesight traveling up this. This is a neighbor's garden in my neighborhood. You can see, good job, very well done. Proportion is very well done here. It goes along with the hardscape. You want to soften this so it's the right height. You want this not too high to block the window, so this is proportioned well. And as you walk up to the front steps, your eye transitions to the height of the garden, and here you have some movement from breezes that may be at the front of the property. Hang on for a second here. Let me get this right. Okay, so, whoops, what's going on? Okay, hang on. Right. I'm not sure why this is jumping around. Okay. So we've gone through the key steps, but what I want to mention is if you're not sure what to do, not to worry. You can start small and experiment. Best way to start with is a small bed or border garden. And these, again, are my gardens. And I started each of these not trying to plant everything all together, but experimenting and doing it in phases. So, perennials for colors and bloom periods, adding a few shrubs here and there, and then maybe ornamental grasses or some trees. But it's something that you can do, over a period of time. And as you see the garden evolve, you can change how you want to do it. So the last part, excuse me, the last part, I apologize, I'm not sure why this is jumping around. Okay, well, right, hopefully this stops. The one thing I want to talk about is, use layering very effectively is a good way to create a garden pretty easily. And if you visualize colors during different seasons, you can add a dimension to it. So from my perspective, a well-designed garden will include plants with a variety of foliage, textures, colors, or hues, seasonal blooms, shapes, and sizes, and hardscapes and softscapes. This is a small garden that I have, and I didn't know what to do with this area, but ultimately I noticed that by layering it, it would give a nice softened appearance to the hardscape in front of the garden. So this is the garden in the spring. In the summer, we see some of the grasses coming up, and by fall we have a completely different look, different hues of green with a lilac bush in the background. So the viewer's eye travels from the hardscape and it goes up, and the viewpoints change as it gets into the different plants that we have. And that is something that changes through each of the seasons. Okay, so now let's talk a bit about planting locations. As I say earlier, planting locations can present different attributes and challenges. And these are, I think, something that we all generally sort of understand, but it's good to reflect as you design and plan what kind of issues locations can present, or what kind of attributes you can have from different locations. So banks and slopes, I think they are a wonderful place to have gardens. They're effective for countering erosion and water runoff. They're a good place to have a rock garden. But the best part of a slope is you can create a different kind of visual dynamic, because you have an instant view that gradually goes up vertically, and you can create different schemes of visual effect, which can be dynamic or static at different levels of the slope. You can have different contrasting plants and textures that are immediately visible because they're above each other. And so there are a lot of sort of options that banks and slopes present for your creative aspirations. Ground covers are an effective way to plant on slopes because they're fibrous roots. They help with the erosion, countering the erosion. And slopes are a good place for trees and shrubs, as well as ornamental grasses. Beds and borders, which are typically what most people enjoy creating, are a wonderful place to experiment with a composition of color schemes and different shapes, different forms. A good way to do a garden, a bed or a border garden is to identify what you think is your star performer and then build around that as the supporting cast for it. It's a great area to have vibrant colors or even just muted colors. And you can add shrubs and trees to add structure and shape to the garden. Decorative edges. It's a great way to soften a landscape. Make sure that you're using plants that are not too tall. You can have leaves and flowers, but having an edge that is not too high gives the viewer a balance or rhythm to the hardscape, such that it's not too abrupt to make it harmonious, create some unity in terms of the plant selections. And keep in mind that when you choose the plants, this shouldn't be the type of plants that have a lot of droppings so that you don't have slippery conditions. Privacy screens, hedges, and climbers. Many of our residential landscapes, we like to have privacy. So this is a nice way to have a garden project. Long term, it's relatively inexpensive because once you've set it up, it's, it doesn't really take a lot of maintenance, except keep in mind that ivies and vines do require a lot of maintenance. And once they're established, they're hard to eradicate. These are mostly monoculture in nature, so you need to have plenty of sun. And they also present issues from disease and pests. So you have to be monitoring them carefully for that. You can have colorful, this is forsythia, colorful hedges. They don't need to be only green. So there is flexibility in terms of how you can do this. Containers are a wonderful way to dive into gardening. Not a lot of work, easy to maintain. You can create a little story for a particular area of your hardscape. You can frame the entrance to your house, for example, through containers. You can use some unusual plants to give a different feel to your landscape. They're easy to feed, water, and you can change them up seasonally if you want to. And they can be inexpensive. Raised beds, it's a great idea to do if you don't enjoy bending over your garden, especially if you have large gardens. And it's easier, more physically, to enjoy and maintain a garden that is at a raised level. It can be informal by using wheelbarrows or other structures. The best thing about raised gardens, they're easy to weed, maintain. You can modify them throughout the years. You can keep the soil healthy more readily, and they can provide for better drainage. And you can do areas with raised beds that have pollinators, for example, for one area of your property. Excuse me for a second. Right. So I have become a fan of berms. I think they are a nice way to add an element to the garden. And especially if you have, for example, bedrock in your garden, in your landscape, berm gives you an alternative to trying to amend the site conditions. They provide as much flexibility as your ground garden might. And they can be used to control and manage water runoff, control erosion. Just be careful when you're designing the berm not to have the water runoff so that you have pooled water in one particular area. And they can be designed, they can be built so that there's proper drainage, and make them interesting, have curves, kidney shaped or whatever. Don't build mounds with peaks necessarily, but tend to have dips and valleys in it so that they can have a pleasant roll to the look of the garden. So let's talk now a little bit about garden styles. And this is part of trying to decide how you want to visualize your garden. We've talked a bit about family gardens. You want to make sure that the garden is designed with the seating arrangement that you may have for the patio area. You may have just a small garden. It could be two pathways that meet, but you can do a ground cover here and plant something that adds a dimension to it. Make sure that the garden is appropriately sized for where the garden is located if it's small. And raised gardens, of course, we talked a bit about that. They're good for small gardens as well. On the other side, you've got large gardens, and you can be very dynamic with large gardens. So it gives you more room for creativity and experimentation. Large gardens, typically, it's good to have some structure with larger shrubs and trees and a bit of hardscape. Cottage gardens are just wonderful. I mean, basically, it's organized chaos, but it's a planned organized chaos. It's not just throwing everything in there, but they have a nice visual element to giving a sense of formality and a different feel of the property. So that's, if you have a place for doing something like this, it's a nice added element to your landscape. Wildlife gardens are becoming popular. Pollinator gardens, wonderful, attracting birds, butterflies, bees, insects. And I think, more and more people find that families and children will enjoy them. So this is becoming more popular. Adding bird baths and feeders will help attract wildlife to your garden. Now, on the other end of having a cottage type garden is the formality of a formal garden. Now, most of us don't have elaborate properties like this, but this sort of gives you the elements of a formal garden, which is intentional lines, intentional shapes, so that the visual sense of the garden is very planned. And there's an element of making a garden look more, how do I say, not only intentional, but intentionally formal. And it doesn't have to be a large property. This is a neighbor's garden, and in a sense, it's formal, it's circular, and there's a circular arrangement that arises from the nature of this garden. If you're fortunate to have woodlands in the back of your property, you use that to create a garden, select plants that can survive damp and shade environment. Rock gardens, another great way to use attributes of your landscape. Natural mineral stone is a nice way to add a look to your garden. This garden here is another neighbor's garden, and what he does or she does is use little toys, because the children from school sort of go back and forth across this area of the property. So I thought that was a pretty cool thing for them to do. Meadows, they look like they're not planned, but they actually can be planned. But you have to maintain them because they have a tendency to go to weed, so quote unquote, or be dominated by invasives. Water gardens, if you're fortunate to have water on your property, use that to your advantage. From reflections, you can create the sense of movement, attract wildlife. It's a whole different sort of hardscape look you can give to it with pebbles and so on. It has a calming effect, so you can use restrained colors for that type of garden. And rain gardens are becoming more and more common. This says it all. Demonstration rain garden. This garden is designed to catch, soak up, filter storm water before it runs off to local waters. Rain gardens remove pollutants, reduce flooding, and help recharge groundwater. This is a picture of a rain garden in a county in Maryland. And there was a lot of public discussion about the municipality installing rain gardens because the streets were constantly being flooded. And from my perspective, I think it's a great idea for a municipality to undertake a rain garden to address this kind of problem. But many property owners were very concerned that rain gardens would affect their property values. I'm not sure why they would think that, but it actually ended up being quite a bit of a debate. Ultimately, the municipality won out the issue, and I think it was a great result. Natives, again, becoming more popular. The great thing about natives, they occur naturally. You don't have to do a lot. But the other wonderful thing is they flourish as they should. They have, you don't have to deal with pest issues. They manage runoff from rain. They have deep root systems to keep your soil healthy and erosion free. And they can look very nice. So types of plants, well, we talked earlier about preparing lists of plants, and I think everyone has a good idea what types of plants are. But what I do is prepare like a list of broad areas, categories of plants, and then I narrow my selection. So, you have annuals and perennials. These are the foundations for your gardens. Typically, you have biennials. The annuals are nice because every season you can change up the appearance of your garden pretty easily. Bulbs, great addition because it announces that your garden is coming into performance for the summer, and I think we all love bulbs. Ground covers are a wonderful way and also inexpensive way to help add to your garden as an element to the rest of the plants that you have. I'm a fan of ornamental grasses. Here we have, this is another neighbor nearby, and they just have these three tall ornamental grasses, which look very nice pretty well all year round and provide privacy and nothing else. The grasses can be of different hues and colors. Shrubs, azaleas, other shrubs, great way to provide privacy, yet decorate a corner of your landscape. Trees, of course, if you have the space for it, it's nice to be able to add these as a structural element to your landscape. And we've talked about climbers, vines, ivies, that nice to use to dress up fences and walls, but require maintenance. And now let's talk a little bit of maintenance and care. This is a topic unto its own, but the reason I mention this is one, involves effort and time. And when you plan your garden, keep in mind how much maintenance you're willing to put in, and it involves costs. So select the plants based on your available time and effort. Check the health of your plants, maintain a healthy soil, nutrients. We talked about that. Watering, make sure you have mulch. Use stakes for plants, cages, like for example, peonies where needed. Tackle the weeds. The sooner you get to them, the easier they are to maintain. Deadheading, fall cutback, prune shrubs, trees, trim hedges, pest control, and clean your tools. That's very important. Frost protection. One thing I should mention is if your property is prone to visits from deers, then keep that in mind. Deers love things like tulips, azaleas. There are a lot of plants that they will munch off. So if you have that kind of issue, then you need to incorporate in your budget something to protect against that, or choose your plants accordingly. Okay, case study. Before we start, I want to give a shout out to June Penny. She was instrumental in creating the gardens you're about to see. So I'm going to talk a bit about a project I did here, and hopefully this will give you an idea of the process. So we had purchased another property, and the property presented some challenges. We did the outside of the housing siding, but most importantly, the landscaping was just horrendous. So you can see this is not very pleasant. Here was mostly rough grass and weeds, so it wasn't, and the back of the house was the same, and there was this utility pole. So I decided to invest some time and energy to doing some landscaping. So I start off with a elevation picture of the house, And rather than doing a whole overhead design first, I want to do a broader idea of what my design would look like. And my idea or vision was, one, I didn't really like this semicircle driveway. It wasn't necessary. And two, I wanted to make an appearance that when we walked out of the house, we could see something that we could enjoy. And passerbyers, mostly this is a rural road, so cars going by could have a visual effect of a garden that they could see while driving by. So I decided to make the driveway only halfway to this point and then put sort of a walkway around the house and then try to think about gardens for the rest of the area. So I took a photo, put tracing paper over the top, and came up with the basic idea being, here's the driveway, comes up to about here, and I'm going to put some gardens over here. I'm going to do some hedges on this side for privacy. And here I'm going to put a berm all the way along because the site conditions were very poor. So that was my basic concept. And then I started thinking about what I want to plant. And I decided that for structure, I was going to do the hedges on both sides and took 2 fir trees because in the winter, I wanted some color, a Japanese maple, and then I used a bunch of boulders, which dug out from behind the house and placed them up here to get some hardscape to the brim. Added some ornamental grasses, and then would add some perennials. And this was sort of the shrubs along the way. So this is just, again, broad strokes. It doesn't have to be pretty. I'm not an artist, but it just gave me an idea of where I was headed. And then I looked at the closer vision, sort of closer elevation of the house for the front gardens and put tracing paper over my photo and just came up with an idea saying, okay, here's all I want, a couple of shrubs, one big shrub, a few little ones, and maybe a dwarf evergreen matching, and then just have beautiful, bright, colorful perennials. So that was the concept, and then implementing it. Here's the driveway that was built. Here are the boulders that I moved to the berm, created a berm. You see, it's not like peaks, like one big mound, but it sort of rolls along. And this is the first tree that went in, the fir tree. Now we've got the Japanese maple, the 2 fir trees a year. I'm adding elements as I go along with the garden. And then this is a little bit later, 2 years later, it's all filling in nicely. And I'm continue to add. It's not, so it's phase by phase. Here's the hedge line that goes down the driveway. These are the 2 front gardens that the 2 viburnums, the dwarf perennials. And then walking out the front door, here's the berm. The road is there. So this is what we look at when we walk out. This is the pathway going, the flagstone pathway, the viburnum here. So you can see how nicely it's filled in. Here's the hedge line that I put in. And this is the end of the driveway. Walking along the road is this way. You see it's all filled in. So this was built out over time. It didn't have to be done all at once. And this is the back of the house, so a lot of work needed. Dug everything out, and I wanted to create evergreen line here and here so that I would have something to look at during the winters. And this is the evergreens planted, the turf's been put in. And here, going back to the original project, here, this area was pretty ugly, but it's not a big area. And it's the garden that I talked about before, the small one. And this is the area that came up with this garden. So you can see what changes a garden can have to your property. The back of the property, put in evergreens, and before doing anything else, I built the soil conditions for my gardens. So this is the nice soil conditions properly put in with the trees planted, and then I could start with the rest of the project. And this is that area you saw with the soil that was set up. This is how the garden turned out there. The trees have now grown up. Same thing where the shed is, put in the soil before doing anything else. And also soil back behind here, another garden bed there, so that we have this garden here to soften the hardscape of the shed, and here as well. And then in the fall, the grasses have gotten tall. Late winter, this is late November, early November maybe. As the garden is dying out, this is grown nice and tall and gives the visual effect as the wind off the water comes in. and then this as well. And then to add container plants, just for the patio area. This actually has drip irrigation so that it's easy to maintain. And then in the winter, this is the look of the back before everything was put in, and now this is with the trees on either side and the gardens in the back. And during the winter, we have the pop of color, the pop of a color in otherwise a dreary landscape. So that is the end of my presentation. And thank you for participating.